Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us a really comprehensive guide on how to buy physical silver.
That's right.
And our mission today really is just to jump straight in. We want to cut through all the detail and pull out the absolute most important bits of knowledge, the core insights you really need.
Exactly. This guide, it pretty much lays out the essential landscape for anyone thinking about getting into physical silver. It covers, well, everything from the different ways you can actually own it physically to the practical steps, like buying it, storing it safely. Think of this as our deep dive, but into your source material.
Okay, so we're planning to unpack the different forms silver takes, when you actually go to buy it.
Right. Coins, rounds, bars.
Yeah, and understand what actually influences the price you pay, like beyond just the market rate.
Yeah, premiums, yeah.
And how to make sure you're, buying from the right people and actually getting the real deal.
Super important.
And then critically, what you need to do with it once you've got it, how to keep your investments safe.
Okay, so let's start where the source does. It frames physical silver right away as a traded asset. It mentions its spot price, alongside gold, platinum.
Right.
So that's our baseline. We're dealing with a commodity. Its value is constantly shifting. Global market, supply and demand.
And the guide, it pretty quickly zooms in on the three main ways you can physically own silver, doesn't it?
It does.
Coins, rounds, and bars. So let's explore what the source says about each one and why those distinctions actually matter.
Absolutely. So first up, silver coins. The source really highlights these as like a super popular entry point for a lot of people.
Okay.
And what makes them stand out, according to this guide, is their status. They're government minted.
And legal tender.
The guide makes a big deal about them being government minted. What's the real significance of that for someone just starting out based on this material?
Well, the guide points out that government backing, it immediately gives them this layer of guaranteed authenticity and quality, too.
Because they're legal tender, they're just instantly recognizable.
Yeah.
Pretty much anywhere in the world. And that generally makes them highly liquid.
Liquid, meaning just easier to sell.
Easier to buy, easier to sell, yeah.
Yeah.
Compared to maybe some other forms.
Yeah.
The guide specifically names examples, the popular ones. American Silver Eagle, the Canadian Silver Maple Leaf, Austrian Silver Philharmonic. Those are the big ones it mentions.
And I noticed the source also mentions coins can have this collectible value, numismatic value, I think it called it.
Numismatic.
Something beyond just the silver content. But the guide seems a bit cautious. Like, it says while that's possible, it often means you're paying more upfront, a higher premium.
Exactly. Which actually brings us neatly to silver rounds. And this is where the guide gives a really, really clear comparison.
Okay.
Unlike coins, rounds are typically made by private mints, not government ones.
So, if they're not government-backed, does the guide say they don't have that legal tender status or a face value?
They don't. No. The guide really emphasizes that. Rounds are not legal tender.
Yeah.
They don't have a face value printed on them. Their main purpose is just, pure bullion investment.
What's interesting here, reading through the source, is how that one difference kind of ripples through everything else. The guide points out that because they're really just about the silver content and they lack that government stamp, their value is pretty much entirely based on the silver spot price, which, fluctuates.
Right. And their purity guarantee.
Yeah.
That relies on the reputation of the private mint that made it, not a government.
That seems like a key difference.
It's a big one. Collectability is generally much lower with rounds, too. And the designs, they could be basically anything the private mint wants. It's not like the regulated designs you see on government coins. And the guide makes a really crucial point about cost. Rounds typically have lower production costs. And that translates usually directly to lower premiums for you, the buyer.
Yeah.
Lower than most government coins, anyway. That's a big takeaway if your main goal is just stacking silver weight at the lowest possible cost over the spot price.
Okay, so you've got government coins, authenticity, liquidity, maybe some collectible upside, but higher premiums.
Generally, yeah.
And then private rounds, focus purely on the silver content, lower premiums, but you're relying more on the mint's own reputation. That comparison table in the source really spells out that trade-off.
It really does. And then the third main form the guide covers is silver bars.
Right, the big ones.
Yeah, often popular if you're looking to buy larger amounts of silver all at once.
And the guide notes that bars, they typically have the lowest premiums per ounce compared to coins and often even rounds. So the most cost-effective way to buy in bulk.
Correct. They come in a huge range of sizes, too.
Yeah.
From a little 1-ounce bar right up to 100 ounces, or even bigger sometimes.
Wow.
And the source flags this pretty quickly. That cost effectiveness, that size benefit, it comes with a pretty significant trade-off.
Yeah.
Storage, it just becomes a much more serious consideration. You need a really secure place for these larger, heavier items. It's not like slipping a few coins in a drawer.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So you know what forms it comes in.
Oh.
Now, the big question this guide tackles next is, how do you actually buy it safely and understand what you're paying?
Yes.
And the first step the source really hammers home is finding reputable dealers.
Research is just paramount here, according to the guide.
Yeah.
Absolutely key. You want dealers with, ideally, a long history. You want verified, positive customer reviews, maybe industry certifications if they have them, and transparency in their pricing. That's a big one. The source lists as non-negotiable.
Yeah, you need to know what you're paying for. And the guide kind of weighs the pros and cons buying online versus actually going into a store.
It does. Online obviously offers convenience, probably a wider selection usually.
Right.
But you absolutely have to scrutinize the vendor. Like really verify their website, dig into reviews, check forums maybe. Because the risk of scams, it's just higher online.
Makes sense. And in-store.
Well, in-store gives you that ability to physically inspect the silver. Hold it, look at it before you hand over any money. That can be really reassuring, especially if you're new to this.
I can see that.
But the flip side is your product options might be limited just to whatever they happen to have in stock right then.
Yeah.
And the prices could be a little higher sometimes just because they have overheads. Rent, staff.
Right, the cost of doing business. But regardless of how you buy, online or in-store, the guide is crystal clear on one thing, a crucial step.
Let me guess. Receipt.
Exactly.
Ugh.
Always ensure you get a detailed receipt. And documentation for your purchase. That's your proof. Proof of ownership, proof of authenticity.
Absolutely essential. Couldn't agree more. And okay, so once you actually have the silver, maybe in your hand, verifying its authenticity and quality is the next thing the guide covers.
How do you do that?
It recommends looking for the standard purity markings, like 999 or sometimes 99999. That indicates fine silver. If you're ever really uncertain, the source does mention professional testing as an option. You could get it assayed. And it strongly advises, if possible, buying directly from government mints or really well-known private refineries because they just have such stringent quality control. It gives you a much higher level of assurance.
Yeah, the guide even mentions a whole separate section they have on protecting against counterfeits, which tells you this isn't just, a theoretical risk. It's something you actually need to watch out for.
It's definitely real. Okay, moving on to understanding the cost. The guide breaks this down really well into two key concepts, spot price and premiums.
Spot price, that's what the guide calls the current market price per ounce, right? The baseline price that's always fluctuating based on global supply and demand.
That's it, the starting point.
Yep.
And premiums. Those are all the costs added on top of that spot price.
Like what?
Well, the source lists things like manufacturing costs, actually making the coin or bar, distribution costs, and of course the dealer's own markup, their profit. And a key insight from the guide here is that these premiums, they aren't fixed. They vary. A lot, actually. Based on the type of silver we talked about, coins usually being higher than bars.
Right.
Based on current demand for that specific product. And maybe it's rarity, too.
So the price you actually pay isn't just that spot price you see quoted everywhere. It's the spot price plus this premium. And understanding what goes into that premium and why it varies seems vital to getting a decent deal.
Totally. And speaking of influences, the source also details factors that affect the spot price itself. The underlying silver price.
Ah, okay. What drives that?
Yes. And this is where the guide really connects silver to the bigger picture. The economy, world events. It highlights industrial demand as a major driver.
Industrial.
Yeah, silver is used in a surprising amount of stuff. Electronics, solar panels, medical devices. So changes in those industries, they directly impact silver demand.
Interesting. I didn't realize it was so widely used.
Oh, yeah. Then there's geopolitical instability, uncertainty, conflicts. That often pushes investors towards safe haven assets. Like silver, draws up the price.
The flight to safety.
Exactly. And then just general macroeconomic indicators. Things like inflation rates, currency strength, interest rates. They all play a significant role too.
So knowing these factors helps you kind of understand why the price is moving, maybe, and could inform your timing. The guide does touch on timing, noting that because prices fluctuate so much, when you buy can be important.
It can. The source points out that, historically anyway, silver prices have often done pretty well during economic downturns or periods of high inflation,
Why is that?
because investors tend to seek out assets that are perceived as hedges against that kind of uncertainty,
Yeah.
or hedges against inflation eroding purchasing power. So monitoring those economic indicators the guide mentioned earlier, it's useful for maybe gauging potential timing opportunities or risks.
Right. And alongside timing, the guide really emphasizes budgeting.
Yeah.
Seems obvious, but important.
Crucial. You absolutely need to figure out a comfortable amount to invest, something that doesn't mess with your core financial stability, your emergency fund, that sort of thing.
And your budget, the guide suggests, should factor in not just the silver costs, but also those premiums. It even gives typical ranges, like 5–15% for coins, maybe 2–10% for bars, 5–12% for rounds.
Yeah, those ranges are helpful ballpark figures. And you also need to consider potential storage costs, depending on how you plan to store it.
Good point.
And it's wise, the source suggests, to maybe have some funds set aside. So if prices do dip significantly, you have the option to buy more, if that fits your strategy. Dollar cost averaging? Potentially.
Okay, so understanding your budget, the spot price, the premium,
Yeah.
getting all that straight before you even start looking seems like the way to go, which leads us nicely into the strategic thinking the guide encourages for, well, protecting your investment long term.
Right. The guide prompts you, the buyer, to clarify your own investment goals first. Like, what are you actually trying to achieve here? Are you looking for, say, short-term gains, trying to play the price volatility? Or is this more of a long-term thing? Wealth preservation, maybe a hedge against inflation?
And your goal really shapes your whole approach, doesn't it?
Completely. Short-term trading requires, active market monitoring, being ready to buy and sell relatively quickly. Long-term is more about just accumulating silver steadily as a stable store of value, less about timing the market perfectly.
Okay. And for either strategy, the guide says staying informed is critical.
Absolutely. It suggests keeping an eye on financial news, economic reports,
Right.
even reputable investment forums online, though you have to be careful there.
Right.
Setting up price alerts on your phone or computer can also help you track opportunities or significant moves.
Makes sense. And finally, and this seems maybe the most critical piece, according to this guide, you have to protect the physical investment itself.
Yes. Once you own it, safeguarding it is priority number one. Protecting it from theft, obviously, but also from damage. And preserving its condition helps maintain its value down the line.
So how do you do that? The
Yeah.
source talks about storage solutions, starting with just keeping it at home.
Right. Home storage. The clear pros there are convenience, and immediate access to your silver whenever you want it.
But the cons seem pretty significant too. Increased risk of theft, potential for damage from fire or flood.
Definitely risks. The guide's advice for mitigating those risks is, first, invest in a high-quality safe. Something properly rated, fireproof, waterproof if possible,
Okay.
and maybe bolstering your overall home security system could be worthwhile too.
And the guide adds another really vital layer of protection for home storage, doesn't it?
It does. Insurance. Purchasing insurance specifically designed to cover precious metals stored at home.
Does standard home insurance cover it?
Often not fully, or only up to a certain low limit. So specific precious metals insurance is key. It covers you against theft, loss, or damage. And crucially, the source really reminds you of this. Keep meticulous records. Purchase receipts, photographs of your items, maybe even serial numbers if applicable. It just makes any potential insurance claim so much smoother.
Good advice. What's the alternative to home storage?
The alternative this guide presents for, like maximum security, is using professional vaults, third-party storage facilities.
Okay.
These places are purpose-built for storing precious metals. They have state-of-the-art security systems, environmental controls to prevent tarnishing, the works.
Sounds secure. What's the catch?
The clear trade-off, the guide notes, is the cost. Professional vaults aren't free. They come with storage fees, often based on the value or weight of what you're storing, and usually separate insurance premiums on top of that.
So it's a decision then, balancing that highest level of security against those ongoing costs versus the convenience but also the risks of storing it yourself at home.
Exactly. It's a personal calculation based on how much you have, your risk tolerance, and your budget for storage.
And that really brings us to the end of our deep dive into your source material on buying physical silver.
Feels like we covered the main points.
I think so. We've pulled out those core knowledge points, the different forms, coins, rounds, bars, and their trade-offs. How the real price works, spot plus those varying premiums.
Right, the importance of reputable dealers, verification.
Absolutely. The need to verify authenticity, aligning your buying strategy with your actual investment goals, and that non-negotiable need for secure storage, whether you choose home or professional.
And just to reiterate, this entire deep dive, everything we discussed, was built strictly from the guide you provided. We aim to give you a really focused extraction of its most valuable insights.
Exactly. So here's a final thought for you to consider, building directly on what the source said about those factors influencing the price. Given how deeply integrated silver is in, say, industry, and how its price seems to react to geopolitical shifts and economic news, how might you start looking at major news headlines a bit differently now? How could you maybe start connecting seemingly unrelated world events to potential movements in the silver market? Something to think about.